Patrick Henningsen talks on today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome to the Patrick Henningsen Show today, Monday, the 22nd of July, 2024. This is Basil Valentine sitting in for Patrick Henningsen. Today, I will be joined by one of the wisest, best informed, most articulate and generally intelligent people that I have the pleasure of associating with here on TNT, and that is the Canadian journalist and filmmaker Trish Wood. But we're going to be talking about, well, the whole of the current global situation, whether it's the way that the ICJ rulings on Israel have been ignored by the media as well as politicians, notably last week, the ruling that the occupation of the West Bank is illegal and that the presence of Israel on stolen land must come to an end as soon as possible. That's been completely ignored both by corporate media and, of course, Western politicians, as well as the rulings on the genocide. And then we roll on to the question of the United States, currently in a state of political turmoil. Democrats seem to be very ready to anoint Kamala Harris as the preferred candidate. But if you dig a little deeper, a San Francisco lawyer with a record of being soft on crime, extremely soft on the border, and with no meaningful accomplishments to her name, is she really going to appeal to those important working class and middle class voters in the swing states in the Rust Belt? Barack Obama doesn't seem to think so, which is why he's holding back from endorsing her. But as yet, no major Democrats have thrown their hat in the ring. Some are saying they're expecting a couple of weeks of testing the water with Kamala to see how she stands up in the polls. If she manages to improve on Biden's standing and perhaps even take a lead over Donald Trump, then they'll stick with her. If, on the other hand, she is tanking in the polls and Republicans manage to launch some successful attack ads that fundamentally undermine her candidacy, then they may decide to go for an open convention in the end after all, and another round of popularity contests will take place. It's worth noting, of course, and I'll be discussing this with Trish, that she was one of the chief architects of the cover-up of Biden's mental impairment. For months, years, she claimed he was in tip-top shape when it was perfectly obvious that he wasn't. So she's fundamentally dishonest. Nothing new in that in American politicians, but it's yet another black mark against her, if you'll pardon the pun. She was, of course, only ever elevated to the job of vice president because of her race and gender, having dropped out of the primaries in 2020, months before the first vote was even cast, because her support simply disintegrated once people got a closer look at her. Now she's already spouting the hyperbole. She says Joe Biden's accomplishments as president are unmatched in modern history. Well, I'd have to agree with her, but for very different reasons. I'd call the massacre of, as the Lancet estimates, at least 186,000 Palestinians and the mutilation of hundreds of thousands more as a uniquely evil and repugnant accomplishment by Joe Biden. And personally, I can't wait to see the back of him. Other talking heads like Kayleigh McEnany and Sean Hannity over on Fox, they're saying if Biden isn't able to stand for re-election, why is he remaining as president at all? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. He may not feel he could be in office in 2 years or let alone 4 years from now, but that he does have the mental ability to continue until January. But personally, I doubt that. I think he's already well past his sell-by date. And another question that remains unanswered in all this is, who is really making the decisions in the White House? It very obviously isn't him. Most people are saying it's Barack Obama behind the scenes running the show. Others say Nancy Pelosi. We don't really know is the answer. Ted Kaufman, one of Biden's closest advisors, Ron Klain, who knows? we're just left clutching at straws. But it certainly isn't anybody ever voted for, nor did they vote for the raft of policies that came along with Biden and Harris, which I think will weigh the Harris candidacy down like an anchor. We have two very different realities emerging from the Biden presidency, one where he's been a rip-roaring success and the other where he's been a catastrophic failure. Harris is claiming that in one term, he has already surpassed the legacy of most presidents who served 2 terms in office. And I first came to know President Biden through his son, Beau. We worked together as attorneys general in our states. And back then, Beau would often tell me stories about his dad. I wonder what those stories were, Kamala. He would talk about the kind of father and the kind of man that Joe Biden is. Yes, an utterly corrupt, venile, self-serving politician. The qualities that Beau revered in his father are the same qualities that I've seen every day in our president. His honesty, his integrity, his commitment to his faith and his family, his big heart, and his deep love, deep for our country. I'm finding it difficult to read these words, I'm afraid, viewers. And I am first-hand witness that every day our President Joe Biden fights for the American people, and we are deeply, deeply grateful for his service to the nation. Right, well, I think you speak for yourself on that score, Kamala. In the second half of the programme, I'll be joined by Lord Christopher Monckton to ask how a Donald Trump presidency would affect the so-called global warming targets, and likewise how the creation of the new GB Energy Company, which is supposed to be both lowering bills and run entirely on renewables, how on earth that is going to fit into the UK's energy matrix. But first, I'm delighted to say I'm joined on the line from Ottawa in Canada by the venerable, the extremely wise and equally well-informed Trish Wood. Welcome to the program, Trish.
Hi, how are you? I'm sort of Ottawa, but really in the wilds, out in the wilderness in Canada right now, as you can see by the background here. And hopefully that won't cause any technical glitches, but amazing technology. And I can't believe the times in which we live. I can't, just listening to your opening, I was like, I can't believe all this stuff is happening right now. It's really something, isn't it?
It is, and I'd like to start with what I'm calling the global constitutional crisis. And I think it's a crisis not only political, but more than ever of information and the way access to information shapes public opinion. Towards the end of last week, the International Court of Justice ruled in a matter entirely separate from the genocide in Gaza, a separate case which was brought by dozens of countries. It ruled that the Israeli occupation since 1967 of the West Bank and Gaza is unequivocally illegal under international law, and that the settlements it's built, every single one of them on the West Bank, must be removed, and Israel must indeed completely remove its presence from the West Bank and Gaza. And yet, first of all, this was not reported at all. This bombshell announcement was completely ignored by the corporate media, as far as I can tell, on both sides of the Atlantic, when it should really have been headline news. Instead, everybody's obsessing over Trump's grazed ear and whether or not Biden was going to resign. And secondly, of course, there's been no reaction of any meaningful extent from politicians in the West. In fact, as we speak today, Netanyahu is touching down in Washington to address both sides of Congress, with Speaker Mike Johnson literally fawning. I mean, he could not be more obsequious and supine if he tried. Trish, try and make sense of it for us, please.
Well, I hate to say it, in a sense, I can't make it make sense, because it reveals something so untoward about where we are right now in the West as people. It reveals something about the moral frameworks that we all said that we relied upon and believed in all these years, the ideas that were brought about the humane execution of war, the way that we view hardships of other people, how we view ourselves as citizens of the world, which sounds super lofty, but that's what all of these courts were set up to deal with. There were treaties signed, not all the countries are a party to that. Now, as you say, there is this massive ruling, and the massive ruling essentially says the Palestinians have a point, and they've had a point all these years. We're not debating it anymore. They should have their own sovereignty, as many people have been saying for years and years. It makes the situation in Gaza and the West Bank appear even more and more like the apartheid in South Africa, based on my understanding of what they said. And yet, responding to what you said, there has not been some massive explosion of positive news coverage about it, or in fact, any news coverage about it. And I think it's because we're sliding away from our humanity more and more. And in a sense, it is connected to the Trump-Biden stuff that's happening, because all of it could not be happening if our leaders were not now sitting on thrones of lies, right? The idea of the big lie, either overt or covert, has now taken over our information systems. And one thing about, if I can just be nostalgic for the olden days of news, back when I was working as an investigative reporter, of course, we had many of the same problems of politicization and spin from governments, et cetera, but I felt always that there was a collective positioning of the people delivering the news and receiving the news of a shared humanity, of a framework that we all lived in. We all thought certain things were bad. We agreed certain things were good, and that as citizens, we wanted to be represented in that way in our world affairs. And I think that that's been completely blown to bits by the fractionalization of the media more specifically. And what I mean by that is that Fox News has one position about Israel-Gaza that it feels is the moral position. Legacy media, on the other hand, has a different one. There are people in indie media who have a different one. You and I share probably the same one. And I believe we are right, actually, you and I, on Gaza. But we don't share a collective sense of morality toward each other. And that is how, to answer your question, this massive ruling could come down with very little fanfare. And I also think probably lots of corporate media don't want to deal with it, because the bosses who run those companies and fund them, the BlackRocks and all those people, don't want that ruling to be particularly publicized, because it doesn't suit their needs right now. So it's terrible. And I've been talking about cognitive dissonance since March of 2020. It's unhealthy for us, in a sense, to have things delivered in these ways, but the way it's delivered is either inappropriate or false. And we're always kind of going internally, wow, what's happening in the world? Am I missing something here? And I feel that that's contributing, in a sense, to, I've said this before, to mental illness generally in the citizenry in the West. I think we're not mentally healthy because we're being gaslit and lied to all the time.
I think you're absolutely right. The United States, which often stresses, of course, the rules-based order, which is interesting and very different from absolute respect for international law. The terms were revised a few years ago, weren't they, Trish? From, respect for international law to this new sort of NATO-inspired Atlanticist rules-based order, which basically means we make the rules and we order you to follow them. And the administration criticized the ICJ ruling. I mean, first of all, it was 14-1 or 15-1 or something that the ICJ ruled. Strictly speaking, an administration doesn't have any business criticizing a judge's ruling. It's like, if somebody is found guilty of murder in the first degree and all the evidence there points to them being the murderer, they were holding the gun is covered in their fingerprints, their DNA was found at the scene, they'd already made threatening noises to the deceased and so on and so forth. Absolute slam dunk murder case. It isn't up to third parties to criticize the court's decision. So it's a monumental arrogance in the first place that the United States thinks it's allowed to criticize an ICJ ruling, which already begins to undermine it. Although it acknowledged that Israeli settlements are inconsistent with international law, always this milquetoast nuanced language. The US State Department told Reuters, "We are concerned that the breadth of the court's opinion will complicate efforts to resolve the conflict and bring about an urgently needed just and lasting peace with two states living side by side in peace and security." Well, that's been the kick the ball into the long grass platitude that they've been trotting out for the last 50 years.
And I think part of this, too, has come from what happened in March of 2020, which is lockdowns. And let me just see how this connects. What the lockdowns did to people, especially people who were thinking people, is completely nullify the idea that our institutions have any value or meaning anymore. Things we never thought we'd say, like the World Health Organization, which was sacred, behaved ridiculously. It became untrustworthy. It was lying for people in power. And as a result of all of those terrible things, the fact that public health would endanger the lives of healthy people by inflicting on them these silly rules that did nothing anyway, no one cared, the children were committing suicide. Institutions behaved in such extremely immoral ways that now we're at a point where people are saying UNWRA, they're all Hamas, and Médecins Sans Frontières, this legendary bunch of selfless doctors who will die in a war to save the life of children there, are now somehow impugned as this, sketchy, commie organization. The UN itself, which, I have had my disagreements with over the years, but it exists for a reason. So all these sacred institutions, including the courts, have been undermined by I would say the last 5 or 6 years. And the media has played a huge role in that, I think. We just don't trust them. Imagine saying 5 years ago that UNWRA is a corrupt organization that doesn't deserve funding. I mean, imagine how you would be treated if you said that at a dinner party. People would think you were a monster. But now it's fine because Hamas or something.
Yeah. Well, indeed, the accusations that any members of Hamas were involved with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency are completely and utterly unfounded and baseless. It hasn't stopped the Israelis criticizing the British government, the incoming Labour administration, having restored its funding to the UNWRA, which is at least a small step in the right direction. H. Stuart Knight isn't a name many people are familiar with these days, but he was the head of the Secret Service when John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan, of course, back in 1981. People say Reagan was never the same again. But Kimberly Cheetle, who is currently testifying before the House Oversight Committee, seems determined to stay in her job, despite this being, as she's just admitted herself on Capitol Hill, the worst breakdown of service, the most egregious incident since 1981. And she was eviscerated by Ro Khanna, amongst others, Democratic congressmen. I don't see how she can stay in her job. There are also a lot of conspiracy theories floating around about second or even third gunmen, and more specifically, whether or not Cheetle actively allowed this to happen by not giving Trump the protection that he deserved and indeed that his campaign team were asking for. I think this one's going to run and run, isn't it?
I think so. And I think just in repeating what I said about institutions, the Secret Service has always been an organization that I've had a lot of respect for. I mean, their job is actually to stand in front of the president or whomever they're guarding and take a bullet if bullets are flying. And they commit to that. And they tend to be high-minded people. You'll recall probably the video from the Zapruder film of Clint Hill climbing up onto the back of that car to push Jackie Kennedy back in after Jack's head had been blown apart to protect her. While the bullets either were still flying or had just ended flying, he didn't know. But that event tormented him for the rest of his life, that he wasn't able to save Jack's life. He blamed himself. He was a dedicated guy who was in service of the first couple. I don't get the sense from what I viewed from the day of the assassination attempt, there's still photographs of those hopeless people bundling Trump off while not even knowing how to holster a gun, ducking behind. I mean, it was just absurd. I don't see that they're even the same remote sort of Secret Service DNA as people like Clint Hill. It was a joke. It was an embarrassment. Imagine around the world, people looking at that. And then her responses, it's quite interesting because in Trump's, one of his speeches lately, oh no, it was during the debate, he said something about the Joe Biden administration is no one ever resigns, right? All these terrible things happen. The ruined getting out of Afghanistan, which heads should have been rolling for days over that. No one ever pays a price. And here we go again with this woman who clearly has no idea what she's doing. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is what you alluded to, which is, was this a more complicated idea where they maybe tracked Crooks through his online gaming places where they communicate? I've got two kids who game, and I know they communicate through these places called Steam and other places. Are they ginned up possibly by bad actors there to do these things, and then the Secret Service kind of stands down? I don't know. I'm just blue skying here, but yeah. I think we can now say about what happened that day that it's beyond. I said initially I thought it was just incompetence. I don't feel that way anymore. And one of the reasons I don't is because of what they're saying about the shooter, that he was a kind of a nerd. They're always that, aren't they? Bullied. The school said actually he wasn't bullied. They're creating this whole scenario. And the fact that they say he had no social media, is that credible? That a nerd in a basement gaming who lives online has no social media? Don't believe it. So why are they creating that scenario? I believe because there may have been interactions with people online who were grooming him to maybe take this action. And the second thing, if you roll back and think about how old, I think he was 20 or 21, his parents were both Democrats. So did this kid, obviously troubled, grow up in a household where he was listening to Joy Reid and Hillary Clinton and Rachel Maddow and all the Trump is Hitler people, for 8 or 5 years during his formative years? I mean, actually think about that. The stuff that's been said about Trump would make you want to pull the trigger, given what they say he's an existential threat and that sort of thing. So I think if you put all that together, what they release about him, what they say about his online presence, what they say about his personality, I think it's all a game. I think it's all manipulation. That's why they shot him dead, because he won't be able to stand trial and have any of this stuff ever come out. And this is what they do. They did it with the trans shooter who had a manifesto that was never released. You'll recall that. All of these strange things that happen with the Democrats, they kind of appear for a minute and then they disappear in a fog of storytelling that's never followed up on by legacy media, right? We're just supposed to, remember the Vegas shooter? We never got a story about him either. He killed a ton of people.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. They just disappear in this fog of, no social media, and and we're just supposed to move on. And sadly, we do move on. But I hope that this time it doesn't happen. And the connection between what may have got this kid going, the fact he was on a sloped roof. Remember, her initial response was, we don't put people on sloped roofs. Well, here you've got an amateur kid managed to get up there with a gun on his own, and you can't get Secret Service people up there on a slope. I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd what she's saying. And yet she's still there. Maybe not for long.
Yes, she's there this morning testifying on Capitol Hill and basically being humiliated from what I can tell. We're going to take a short break with the news headlines. When we come back, I'll be asking Trish, is Kamala a shoo-in? And is there a backstory to the Crowdstrike outage? Are we being kept in the dark, basically, about what's really behind that? We'll be right back after these headlines.
We're the pinup boys and poster girls for free speech. We just don't look as impressive as Vladimir Putin shirtless on a horse. Yeah. 24/7, 365. We never stop sifting fact from fiction, misinformation from the truth, from government overreach to the latest on mandates, big tech censorship to propaganda gone mad. Listen to TNT Radio and get the news and views direct from our expert presenters and commentators anywhere you go. Ask Alexa or Google to play TNT Radio or download the TNT Radio app for free from the App Store or Google Play. Today's News Talk. This is TNT Radio.
And welcome back to the Patrick Henningson Show with me, Basil Valentine. I want to ask Trish about the Crowdstrike outing in a moment or two. But first, news has just broken that Nancy Pelosi has indeed endorsed Kamala Harris for the nomination, a very important one. And Associated Press are reporting that early signs are that Kamala Harris is indeed consolidating support among delegates. More than 700 pledged delegates have told Associated Press or announced that they plan to support the US Vice President at the Democratic Convention next month. She was an abysmal candidate 4 years ago. She dropped out after the first couple of debates because she talks in word salads, and the more people see of her, the less they want to vote for her. Is she really the best person that the Democrats can put up, or are they expecting her to take one for the team, allow Trump to get back in for 4 years, and then come again fresh in 2028?
Well, in a sense, they can't ever let Trump get back in, can they? Because they said he was an existential threat who was going to wreck the country and become Hitler and impart all of these terrible Agenda 2025 horrible Heritage Foundation edicts on the country. So they can't actually let him be president because it'll prove that he isn't about to do what they suggested. Being a little bit facetious there, but here's what I think is going on. I think they would never have someone like Kamala Harris take one for the team. They're too power hungry. I think what's going on is that there will be some kind of a switcheroo at the convention. There was talk yesterday morning and this morning that it might be Hillary Clinton, which is horrifying for me and will certainly cause me to have some nightmares again. But I thought we were done with her. I thought like she's proven to be such a dishonest human, and never. I remember when she was running, somebody said she was the most experienced candidate ever because she'd been Secretary of State. And I'm thinking, like, did you see what she did to Libya? I mean, she's actually never succeeded at anything except grifting, right? And so, but that doesn't mean that she won't yet again lead the party. She and Bill still have, because of Obama, this grip on the Democratic Party, and it could be her. It could be Hillary again.
Some people are framing this as some people are framing this as a power struggle between the Obamas and the Clintons. Apparently, there's not much love lost between them. But you're right; it is extraordinary that things like the total destruction of civil society in Libya and the obliteration of Gaza and the murder of 200,000 people, or indeed, for that matter, the Iraq War, these are somehow now treated as achievements. That's how dark things have got, Trish.
Well, remember her line, what is it? She said it to Madeleine Albright. We saw he died. And then they get cackled. I mean, it was the most obscene thing ever.
Mind you, Hillary's cackle is nothing on Kamala's. She's the queen of cackle.
Well, I know, and I think that's where Trump got it wrong.
Hyena on steroids. Go on.
No, absolutely. And I think that's where Trump actually made an error. He's usually pretty good at naming people these funny names. And he's called her Laughing Kamala, and it actually should be Cackling Kamala. I think it has a much better ring, don't you think so?
or just simply the hyena.
Just a hyena. But just getting back to what you said about Obama, there is a crew in Obama's basement up in Kalorama in D.C. of loyalists who I believe have been pulling the strings behind the Biden administration. Anyway, look, no love lost. Talk about Biden and Obama didn't like each other either. So how did he get in there? He got in there because he's manipulatable. That's how he got in. So I don't think that Obama's hold over the White House is going to change because the candidate changes. He mesmerizes them. He's the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain up there in a really fabulous house.
And he indeed himself was installed by David Rockefeller, I believe. But yes, if they want a continuity candidate that the elite can continue to manipulate, then that would be Kamala Harris. If you got one of these popular Democratic governors like Andy Bashar, somebody with ideas of their own, coming with a wet sail a la Jimmy Carter, well, that's the last thing. That's the last thing that the likes of Obama want, isn't it?
Yeah, and what's interesting about this too is that we're just coming off of the huge cover-up about Biden's health, like they weren't all lying about it for years, right? That's going to be buried in this new candidate. They think they're ending it by getting rid of him. But number one, I sort of agree with the Fox News people who are saying, well, if he's too senile to be a candidate, how is he still being allowed to run the country? That is ridiculous. But the infrastructure that was built around keeping this lie alive is huge. And it touches many, many people who exist in the Democrat power structure today. And I think if people take away anything from our conversation today, I hope they take away a bunch of stuff. But the most important point for me is that we've now seen the big lie. We've seen the big lie. It was exposed. They were all, including the media, pretending that Joe Biden was mentally fine when he was not mentally fine. And anybody who challenged that idea was called a terrible person, or they said they were using these fake videos or whatever. They had a whole. So what you're doing by allowing this party to remain without some kind of archaeology about this is setting up just another presidential term that is built around lies and deception. I mean, that we're so used to it now. It's not spin, it's fabrication at all costs to maintain power. It's blatant. We see it. And they're just kind of walking away from it. There won't be hearings. Nobody's going to put Kamala Harris under oath and say, gee, you were lying about Joe Biden's health. That's bad for the country. Why did you do it? That's not going to happen. Even if the Democrats get in, if they don't get in, that won't happen because the GOP won't do that either. They won't do it.
No, you're right. Both are equally bad when it comes to covering their tracks and the sort of total lack of accountability these days. Finally, Trish, Crowdstrike and the outage. A lot of people are saying there's more to this than meets the eye. I thought last week that somewhere deep in the bowels of Microsoft, there was a coder at his computer like that with somebody over his shoulder going, that's the bit you got wrong, just there, change that bit. But in fact, there could be another agenda behind this because, of course, Crowdstrike is linked to some very dodgy individuals and companies, the sort of tech moguls that want to control every aspect of our lives.
Yeah. Well, my blood ran cold when I heard about the outage and then Crowdstrike in the same sentence. It was deja vu for me because I first heard of Crowdstrike when I was investigating. In part, it was the Seth Rich murder case, but it was also just the idea that Hillary Clinton and Debbie Wasserman Schultz had rigged the primaries against Bernie Sanders. They did it, and we know that.
They did.
Because they emailed to each other about it, and God bless Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. They got the emails and they published them and they were exposed. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz was fired over it. Now, she was fired from the DNC and went on to work for Hillary's campaign, which shows
and got a congressional seat in Florida for her trouble.
A congressional seat in Florida. But the reason that Crowdstrike enters that story is because when they were exposed through WikiLeaks, they started complaining about how could this possibly have happened? It must have been the Russians. It must have been the Russians. That was the trope at the time. The FBI volunteered to review the server to see if they could tell from the metadata if these were Putin's people hacking the DNC. Russia was the theme at the time. And the DNC would not let the FBI have the server. They refused. So they're saying and the FBI, for all their faults, and they have many, they have really good tech people, like probably the best in the world, if you want to look at something like that. And they refused. And instead, what they did, they brought in a guy named Sean Henry, who is the president of Crowdstrike. It was a newish company then, a cybersecurity firm, to review the server. And he said, after reviewing the server, he indicated that it could have been, likely was, Russian actors who'd hacked the server. And that fed massively into the Russia hoax against Donald Trump, as did the dossier that was also created by Hillary Clinton's legal people, who were preying on that in order to start this narrative about Donald Trump. So just so people know, because this, like you said at the beginning of our discussion, this did not get a lot of attention. In 2017, documents were released, declassified, that showed that under oath, Sean Henry walked back the idea that this had been a Russian hack and said he didn't have any indication or evidence for that at all. So one of the planks of the Russia hoax that tormented GOP, Donald Trump, the country, Mueller, Crowdstrike gave the information to Mueller during the hearings, was a lie. It was an absolute lie. And Crowdstrike was behind that. So now all these years later, in the middle of a Trump assassination, conspiracy theories running while Biden is resigning, Hillary Clinton's pushing to get back in there again, this company that seems to do the bidding of kind of shady DC actors has now been responsible for one of the biggest. Yeah, I feel kind of like Whitney Webb here, because this is what she does so well. You know, these incredible piecing it all together, but they all seem to end up in the same place.
Trish Wood, I can't thank you enough for joining us today on today's News Talk. It really has been one of my favorite conversations, and I look forward to speaking to you again very, very soon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Bye.
We've got to take a short break now. When we come back, I'll be joined by Lord Christopher Monckton and asking, net zero in Britain, is it realistic? Is it desirable? Is it even going to happen? We'll be right back after this short break.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.